I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine the Latest. Today, we report on accusations from Ukraine that Moscow has staged a false flag attack on energy infrastructure in the Kursk region and examine Germany's proposed defence reforms, how much room Friedrich Merz actually has, and how long he has to deliver tangible results.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
It's the worst carnage that this world has seen since World War II.
Absolutely fascinating.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Friday, the 21st of March, 3 years and 26 days since the full-scale invasion began. Today, I'm joined by our Berlin correspondent, James Rothwell. I started with the latest military and diplomatic updates from Ukraine, Russia, and beyond. Now, the fallout, no pun intended, continues from Ukraine's Wednesday night strike on the Engels airbase in Russia's Saratov Oblast. You'll remember we reported yesterday that drones from the Security Service of Ukraine, the SBU, hit the base. This is about 600 k's east of Ukraine and home to the big Tupolev bomber fleet, as well as glide bomb and cruise missile ammunition storage facilities. Right, hold that thought. Separately, there's this whole proposed 30-day ceasefire thing going on, which hasn't been agreed to, so consequently and somewhat obviously hasn't come into force. Now, that annoying fact hasn't stopped Russia trying to use anything they can for their propaganda. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, Russia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson Maria Zakharova, she said that by attacking the Engels military airbase, Ukraine has violated the 30-day moratorium on strikes against energy infrastructure. Okay, great. So military airbase, energy infrastructure, and actually nothing's come into force. But they will try and put this into the narrative as established fact, which is why we stay on top of it. Right, staying in Russia, and the Suja gas metering station in Kursk Oblast, that's a key gas transit facility in the export of Russian gas to Europe, some of which still happening, has been attacked, and there's a lot of footage you'll find online of it in flames. Ukrainian authorities have this morning accused Russia of deliberately attacking it in a false flag attempt to pin the blame on Kyiv. Now, in a post on Facebook, the General Staff said the accusations were baseless and part of a discrediting campaign against Ukraine. They said it was repeatedly shelled by the Russians themselves. The General Staff add that such false flag attacks have happened before, most recently 3 days ago, when the plant was hit by glide bombs. The statement said the Russians continued to produce numerous fakes and seek to mislead the international community. We ask you to trust only official sources, verify the information and not succumb to manipulation. That reporting comes from the Kyiv Independent. Now, also in Russia, an explosion last night rocked an oil depot in the Krasnodar region, so that's east of the Sea of Azov. Firefighters are still trying to extinguish a blaze there that broke out after a Ukrainian drone attack earlier this week. This comes from local regional Russian authorities this morning. So the oil storage facilities at the transshipment point of Kavkazskaya, that's in the Krasnodar Krai region, exploded last night, having been hit initially overnight Tuesday, Wednesday, a few days ago. There's a lot of video on social media that show an enormous ball of flame reaching hundreds of feet into the sky. Russian officials said on Telegram, during the extinguishing process, due to depressurization of the burning tank, there was an explosion of oil products and release of burning oil. The fire then spread to another tank, and the whole area, currently engulfed in flames, has increased to 10,000 square meters, they added. Poor little poppets. Imagine that on a Friday. Okay, otherwise no real change to the lines in Kursk. The Ukrainian positions / area of influence continues to be squeezed there. I make the differentiation because it's very difficult to tell if there's actually any Ukrainian positions still in Kursk Oblast or if they're just still able to deny that the safe use of that area right up against the international border to Russia. Now into Ukraine, and Russia launched a mass drone strike on Odessa yesterday during a visit to the city by Czech President Petr Pavel. God, if only I was there. 3 people were injured during the attack and civilian infrastructure was damaged, Odessa Oblast Governor Ole Keeper said. Now, France's President Emmanuel Macron said once again last night Russia showed that it sincerely does not want peace. I imagine Maria Zakharova will be releasing a statement any minute now about these attacks, or maybe not. Now, Petropavl was in the city talking to Ukraine's Deputy Prime Minister for Restoration, Oleksiy Kuleba, during which time 3 groups of Shahed drones attacked. Now, these guys, they were discussing maritime security, post-war reconstruction and community development, we are told. Mr. Kuleba invited the Czech president to attend the next conference on the reconstruction of Ukraine that is set to take place in Rome this summer. Make sure we get somebody there. Now, the one we may have missed from Wednesday, worth raising now, I think, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said during a press briefing that Washington has moved on from a minerals deal with Kyiv to focus on achieving a lasting ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine. Now, that doesn't mean the mineral deal is off the table, she said, but the two sides had, quote, moved beyond just the economic minerals deal framework and are looking at a lasting ceasefire in Ukraine. Obviously, this comes after Putin effectively rejected Donald Trump's 30-day ceasefire deal that Ukraine had accepted, whilst hiding behind the word and. And do listen back to yesterday's pod for what that's about. It's essentially the difference between proposed ceasefire on attacks on energy infrastructure or energy and infrastructure. Russia trying to work the edges there. But have a listen yesterday, you'll see what that's about. Okay, so the reality, I think, behind the fact that international diplomacy is very hard and some things can't be sorted out with just a couple of phone calls. I think that truth is crashing into the Trump administration with an acknowledgement that the hard work really starts now. Or maybe Caroline Leavitt's statement is the most face-saving way the White House can pass off Trump's inability to get these deals through. Now, I'm interested in this because if Donald Trump feels snubbed and embarrassed on the world stage, chances are he won't push back against Putin. Rather, he'll go for the easier option of trying to pressure President Zelensky to cede further concessions. So we will watch what happens with this minerals deal, whether it expands into the nuclear power plants that we were speaking about earlier this week or elsewhere. Now, finally, from me, a look ahead for a couple of things to take note of next week. Now, first, Russia and the US will hold another round of talks in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia on Monday. Ukraine's going to be there, but in a separate room. More on that shortly. Moscow says that the Russian Federation Council International Affairs Committee chairperson, Grigory Karasin, and the FSB director's advisor, General Sergei Beseda, will lead the Russian delegation in these discussions on technical details of a possible maritime ceasefire in the Black Sea. The FSB, you'll remember, the Federal Security Service, that's the main successor organisation to the Soviet-era KGB. Anyway, the US will speak to the Russian and Ukrainian teams in separate but adjacent rooms in Saudi Arabia. This comes from General Keith Kellogg, Mr. Trump's envoy for Ukraine. He was speaking to ABC News. He said the talks are going to be proximity discussions. He said one group will be in this room and one group will be in another room, and they'll sit and talk, go back and forth, sort of like shuttle diplomacy in a hotel. That's how it's going to work. We'll find out where everybody stands. Okay, that kind of is the definition of proximity discussions. Now, that is good, but for anything meaningful to come out of all this process, all delegations would need to go into it with, firstly, a desire for peace, and secondly, an acceptance that compromise is always necessary. And there is no sign currently that Russia holds either of those positions. But for an idea of how hard this kind of diplomacy is, I would point you to a book by the late Richard Holbrooke, who was President Clinton's chief negotiator to Bosnia in 1995. Now, his book, it was called To End a War. It shows just how tough this kind of diplomacy is. Basically, the Bosnia peace deal was only achieved after the three leaders, the leaders of Bosnia, Croatia and Serbia, were in effect just locked in to the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base just outside Dayton, Ohio, for 21 days in November 1995. And that was after months of shuttle diplomacy, and that was after military deployments by the United Nations and NATO. So this kind of stuff is tough to do when there's desire for peace on both sides, let alone if you're trying to play games. It can't just be done in a couple of phone calls, as I think we're about to find out. Now, the second date for your diary, France's President Macron has said that the coalition of the willing will next meet in Paris on Thursday. It's thought that Mr. Macron is exploring alternatives to putting European boots on the ground, including a peace plan led by the United Nations. He broached the subject during yesterday's European Council summit, which had as a special guest star Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary-General. We know that for all the positive talk, Italy and Spain, possibly among others, are currently sticking to the line that the UN should lead the process, which I think is something designed to sound like they're really leaning into the problem, whilst knowing full well that Russia, that obviously has a veto on the UN Security Council, will be able to stymie or at the very least influence such a process. Now, I wonder if Mr. Macron really does have a plan here, if it's a starter or a non-starter to get the UN involved, or whether a bit like the French nuclear umbrella idea, we'll talk about a bit more about that with James shortly, that he likes just throwing interesting but essentially irrelevant and borderline unhelpful policy proposals around in order to be seen to be setting the agenda, driving the narrative, coming up with fresh ideas, that kind of thing. We will obviously wait and see and continue to report. Now then, I know I said that was the final thing, but I just note, as we're turning to Germany and our Berlin correspondent, I note that Germany today has seized a tanker believed to be part of Russia's shadow fleet, seized off the Baltic coast of Germany, follows a string of sabotage attacks and illegal shipping. This is a Panama-flagged ship called the Aventin, secured by the German maritime authorities, being found off the island of Rügen. It's got a cargo, I'm told here, of 100,000 metric tons of oil worth about 40 million euros, and Spiegel are reporting that it's now German property. The Kremlin has said it had no information about the ship and no knowledge about its owner. That comes from Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson. Anyway, for more from Germany, let's do a deep dive because there's a lot happening from the German front just in recent weeks, so it's about time we had a proper look at this. Delighted to welcome James Rothwell, Telegraph's Berlin correspondent. James, I note today, this morning, Heathrow, the main airport here in the UK, in west of London, is shut due to a fire at a nearby electrical substation. Counter-terrorist police are leading the investigation, but the Met Police say there is currently no indication of foul play. But that story is breaking and developing as we're on air. But I know that you've been looking into other factory fires, of which Russia is very heavily thought to have been involved at Deal. What can you tell us about that, and what else have you been looking at from the German front?
Well, hello, Dom. Thanks so much for having me on the show in the office. It's great to be here. Yes, cast your mind back, if you will, to the summer of 2024 when there was this very, very odd, suspicious factory fire at some premises on the outskirts of Berlin owned by the Deal Group, which is a big German arms manufacturer. It's particularly relevant to the air defence sector. At the time, German authorities initially ruled it out as an accident. They said there did not appear to be any signs of foul play. The concept of foul play, of course, is in the mix today because of the initial speculation about what may have happened in Heathrow. They were then provided, as I understand it, with some intelligence from a foreign intelligence ally, which led the Germans to believe that this had actually been an act of Russian sabotage, and they launched a new investigation into it. The development that the Telegraph, uncovered earlier this week is that there is evidence that not only Russia may have been somehow involved in this factory fire in Berlin, but that Russia actually carried out investigations into fire safety protocols at the factory just before it burst into flames, which obviously looks extremely suspicious. And just to be clear, we're talking about a factory which is a metal producer for Deal, but there have been reports in the German media that it doesn't just produce metals, it actually forms part of the supply chain of military support to Ukraine, and that therefore is why this Berlin factory Deal was targeted. So we've uncovered a bit more information, a bit more context, if you like, about the Russian involvement in how or why they decided to target that particular factory and how they did it, basically using the internet in order to try and find out information about fire engines stationed in the area near the factory, other areas of fire safety protocols. And what was interesting is that my source told me that this suspicious Russian internet activity that happened, the people behind it made no attempt to cover their tracks, and my source suggested that this was an example of Russia actually flexing its muscles, as they put it, so carrying out a hybrid war sabotage attack and then leaving a trail behind to alert the authorities, just to make sure that the authorities knew that Russia was behind it. And quite rightly, as you say, Dom, that is a story that we reported earlier in the week, but it's something that I immediately thought of when I woke up this morning and saw the news about Heathrow.
Yeah, and just to be clear, there is, as I say, the Met Police say that there's no indication of foul play at Heathrow, but we've seen recently that this is the kind of thing that Russia's been getting up to. We had Hayley Dixon on, God, was it earlier this week or last week? Everything's going so bloody fast at the moment. I lose track of time. But when was Hayley last on? She looked at that long investigation into the Bulgarians that were basically working on behalf of Russia. The inference being, or the very strong consideration, that Russia, because of the diplomatic expulsions post Skripal, the nerve agent attack in Britain in 2018, that actually Russia's intelligence network is pretty sparse across Europe, and they're now having to outsource their activities, and hence there's greater chance for Captain Cock-up to turn up and everything to go wrong. But James, can we talk about Friedrich Merz for a while now, please? In particular, the defence reforms, this unlocking, the release of the debt brake, which I had a quick stab at a few days ago, talking about how Germany post-war, the fear of hyperinflation has led German economic policy since then. And this is the first big change to that, to release the debt brake, release up to €1 trillion for defence and infrastructure spending. But what can you tell us about Friedrich Merz's plans and what they mean for Germany and wider Europe?
Yes, so you're absolutely right that we're talking about a situation where Germany for many years has been hyper allergic to debt, a country that doesn't want to take on additional debt as part of its sort of fiscal DNA. And that's a characteristic of Germany that has infuriated European allies for many years, because they see taking on debt as a necessary step to introducing major German defence projects. Enter Friedrich Merz, the winner of the February elections from the conservative CDU party, and he has just passed a absolutely historic reform on German defence. And I'll just unpack a little bit what exactly Friedrich Merz has done and why it's so significant. As you say, Dom, we're talking about a reform that's in two parts. The first bit is an infrastructure fund of hundreds of billions of euros. And the point of that infrastructure fund is to rebuild Germany's ailing public school system, but also its road system and its rail system. And it's been advertised to the German public very much as a fix the basic fundamental aspects of Germany fund. But as we know, roads, rails, critical infrastructure is, of course, also an important part of civil defence. So we're talking about huge amounts of money, huge amounts of debt being incurred in order to, as Mr. Merz himself says, lay the groundwork for a functional, healthy, well-funded economy, which can then also turn to the issue of major defence spending. And that brings us to the second part of the reform, which is the debt brake. So after the financial crisis, Germany introduced this incredibly tough rule in its constitution, which, at the risk of slightly oversimplifying things, basically said Germany's not allowed to take on debts and that there will be strict limits on the amount of debt that Germany can take. What Mr. Merz has done has decided to exempt defence projects of more than 1% on GDP, so major defence projects, to exempt those from the debt brake. In other words, if there's some call for a major defence spending project in Germany that would usually be impossible because of the debt brake, if it costs more than 1% of Germany's GDP, they can do it. There are no limits on whether they can do it. This has opened the door to, in theory, unlimited borrowing in Germany in order to fund these massive defence projects. What do we mean by massive defence projects? First of all, the Bundeswehr, the German army. We all know, and I'm sure you can speak to this in particular, Dom, that for many, many years, the German army has not had a great reputation. It's an army that is notorious, for example, for sending its soldiers to go and take part in NATO exercises with broomsticks instead of machine guns due to a lack of equipment. The Germans freely acknowledge that this is an army that has been underfunded. It's had a lack of attention put into it for many, many years. We're talking about a country that had conscription and then got rid of it because it was so unpopular. Part of this defence firm, the ending of borrowing limits on defence projects. Part of that is about breathing new life into the German Bundeswehr, and that is a root and stem reform of the German Bundeswehr. It's not just about, for example, getting more weapons. It's about potentially a massive increase in the number of military barracks, which may create a situation where, if conscription is reintroduced in Germany, and Mr. Merz's party has suggested that it will come back, will allow raw recruits to go into those barracks to be trained. We're talking about an increase in basic training facilities, shooting ranges, on top of massive buying up of equipment in order to equip this army. It's not just about fixing what I think is known in NATO parlance as capability gaps. It's about a root and stem reform of the Bundeswehr and turning it into a credible army in the European security architecture. It also means massive financial opportunities for companies like Rheinmetall, this great, well-known German arms manufacturer. Tanks also sends, as you know, lots of artillery ammunition to Ukraine. It potentially opens the door to lots of deals with Diehl as well, this arms group that we were talking about earlier in the context of that suspicious fire in Berlin. And it also signals a political intention by Friedrich Merz to not be a passenger on defence in Europe. That's been the case for many years, particularly under Angela Merkel, but also to some extent under Olaf Scholz. Yes, Mr. Scholz announced Zeitenwende. Yes, he announced lots of big reforms on German security policy, but as listeners of this podcast know, he never wanted to send the Taurus missiles. He was terrified of escalation with Russia. He was holding Germany back on defence in areas where Mr. Merz wants to charge forward. And that is why this defence fund is not just about freeing up spending in Germany. It opens the door to a root and stem transformation, potentially, of the German security architecture, and a result of that, perhaps Europe's arms industry as well. It's very, very significant. And just finally, Dom, we now know that this is happening. There's been a bit of a question mark over whether it will happen because it's had to go through multiple layers of legislative approval. It was approved by the Bundestag earlier in the week, and today it's also been approved by the Bundesrat. So, in other words, it is through that, if you like, rubber stamping process. It's got assent. It's going to be implemented. The only question is what the political limits are on how much money Germany wants to put into defence. These reforms remove that Schuldbremse, that debt brake, that limit on borrowing. The only remaining limits are political, and that's the next stage of this story.
Thanks, James. I mean, you snaffle some of my sandwiches there, and I'm about to on your chips, if I'm not mixing too many foodie metaphors there, because that sounds brilliant, but why now? How come Friedrich Merz is able to turn up and suddenly unlock all of this? If there was the desire from the German political class and from society for this to happen, why did it not happen before? Are we just saying that Olaf Scholz just held it all up? I think that might be a bit unfair on Mr. Scholz, and I'm not a massive fan. But I wonder how resilient this is. It's going to take years to develop these capabilities across the German armed forces. And I wonder if the political will and the permission given by society for that political will is going to endure. As in, a year ago, we weren't talking about this. I know Mr. Scholz talked about Zeitenwende and the turning point, and then quick as a flash, nothing happened. But if that desire had been there, why was there not such political pressure? We just heard about it just in the last few months. Unless you're going to tell me differently from inside the country. It seems as if Friedrich Merz just suddenly appeared on the scene with these amazing ideas, and now he's got it through. Is there real depth to the support that these plans will have in German society and in the political class, do you think?
So this is where it gets really interesting. You're absolutely right to raise reservations about the public approval of this plan. And just to explain the timeline here, we've obviously come out the end of an election in Germany in February. And Mr. Merz won the election and then immediately went into coalition talks. And almost in parallel to that process, we had this huge shift in the Trump administration's attitude towards Europe, the Trump administration's attitude towards Ukraine, the Trump administration's attitude certainly towards Russia. And this is why we've seen Mr. Merz move so quickly on this defence issue. If you actually go back to the election campaign, So the earlier stages of the election campaign, before the infamous Munich Security Conference speech by J.D. Vance just before the German elections and the appalling press conference between Trump and Zelensky. If you look at what Merz was saying then, before this kind of paradigm shift in US-Europe relations on security, Merz wasn't actually in favour of reforming the debt brake. He's even on the record saying no one is talking about reforming the debt brake in the short term. And that's why he's been accused by the AFD, and we can come to why the AFD matters in terms of public approval of this in a minute. They accused him of a massive U-turn in terms of this defence project. Would it be fair to say that Germans who voted in this election for Mr. Merz primarily because they wanted tough action on migration, which is the case for many of them, would it be fair to say that they might actually be a little bit taken aback by this huge, bold new reform? Yes, I think that is fair to say. It must be stressed that Merz was responding quickly to this kind of sudden moment of kind of turning on a dime in the context of the US administration's attitude towards Ukraine. This was the moment where Merz came out in response to that and said, I sense that, and I'm paraphrasing slightly here, but he said, I sense that America is now indifferent to the fate of Europe. And that's why this defence fund has been announced so uncharacteristically quickly for Germany. That is what is driving this. But I think you're absolutely right to say, where is the public mood going to be on this? We know that 20% of Germans voted for the basically pro-Kremlin AfD in the last election. There was also a surge in support for the hard left, Die Linke, who are not fans of funneling enormous amounts of money into the pockets of wealthy arms industry companies. So that is a big part of this as well. And that brings me back to the infrastructure fund that I talked about at the top of this discussion. An infrastructure fund which is primarily focused on fixing the schools, fixing the bridges, fixing the roads, fixing the trains that don't come on time. I think there's a bit of a bane and the antidote thing going on here, Dom, with this big reform. You've got the end to debt limits via the debt brake to unlock all of that unlimited spending potentially on defence. But you've also got this infrastructure fund which is trying to appease people who were caught off guard by this sudden announcement. It's trying to appease voters by saying, look, we've got to do this big reform on defence in the interest of European security, but I haven't forgot about the trains that don't arrive on time. I haven't forgot about the toilets and schools that don't flush. I haven't forgot about the fundamental stuff. Don't worry, we're taking on debt in order to fix that as well. And it might be that that just about gets him over the line. We will have to see.
Yeah, so that was going to be my next question. How much time has he got? When will he see the benefits, or when will the society start to see the benefits of primarily the infrastructure side of it, but those that are so minded will see it on the military side as well? When's he going to start reaping the political capital such that he can go into an election and say, see, on the way up, things are looking better? Can you talk to us quickly about the German electoral cycle and how much time he's actually got?
He's not got a huge amount of time, and the infrastructure reforms that he's proposing are going to take years. They're going to take a long time. There are questions as to whether you can even make a dent in the progress that's needed in order to fix German infrastructure, which has been underfunded for many years within this parliament. It's big, expensive, and it takes a long time. But there is so much frustration in Germany about, for example, just the basics not working. The trains don't work, they break down. There was a story quite recently about how statistically German trains are actually worse than British trains, which I think would really take many of our listeners aback. But it is actually the case that German trains, believe it or not, are less reliable than British trains because of the underinvestment. It's a totemic issue in Germany. It may take him a long time to fix that. It may take him a long time to fix these bridges in Germany that apparently are at risk of collapsing at the moment. Key infrastructure at risk of collapsing. But he's expressed an intention to do it, and he's secured the reforms that he needs in order to make it happen. But I think you're right that this could take a very long time. And of course, the AFD is watching this. The AFD wants to win the 2029 election. It's even been argued that that's the real long-term goal of the AFD. That it was never the idea that they'd come first in the election that we just had, that they want to become the de facto opposition party, which is what they are now, and their true goal is to come in first place at the end of the 2029 election result. We can talk about whether the AFD could form a government even if it came first. That's a separate issue. But of course they see a huge opportunity here. The AFD is against the reform to the debt brake. Its leader, Alice Weidel, is an economist who is really quite fiscally conservative and is not keen on this idea of funding big projects with huge amounts of debt. I think they're going to be going on the attack against the CDU, perhaps relentlessly, over the next cycle. And I think it's absolutely the case that that could cause serious domestic problems for Merz at home, which may have an influence on how much further he can move.
Thanks, James. A couple more just to finish off with, if I may, dialing right down into the weeds here of military subjects. How does Friedrich Merz differ from Olaf Scholz on things like Taurus, supply of Taurus to Ukraine? And where does he stand on this idea floated by Emmanuel Macron about sharing France's nuclear umbrella?
Yeah, so on the issue of Taurus missiles, Merz is, it's fair to say, more hawkish than Mr. Scholz. Mr. Scholz, as you know, just completely and utterly ruled out this scenario and blocked it all the way through. Taurus missiles are just not going to be sent to Ukraine under Mr. Scholz. He has had so many opportunities to change his mind on that. Friedrich Merz has signalled willingness to send Taurus missiles. The open question is what sort of goal those missiles would fulfill, whether that would be a question of trying to change the dynamic on the battlefield, and it does feel that events have slightly overtaken that earlier goal. But there's also a debate about whether, and this is very much a debate, but the question of whether it might be useful in the long term in terms of a security guarantee for Ukraine to have Taurus missiles. That's something that's been floated. So Merz has expressed willingness on that issue, which is progress. Where Merz is more ambitious, I think, is the nuclear umbrella. So this is the idea, and Mr. Merz himself expressed this hope, that Germany could be brought under the French nuclear umbrella, brought under the French nuclear shield, in other words. And it was actually the Telegraph that broke this story. I wrote a front page story on this a couple of weeks ago. This idea that, specifically, that France might be willing to send nuclear jets to Germany in order to send a message of strength to Vladimir Putin as part of that more long-term plan of bringing Germany under the French nuclear umbrella. It's something where we've definitely seen willingness on the German side to do this. We've absolutely seen willingness on the French side to do it. And I think they're just putting their heads together on how to actually implement this idea. But remember how nervous Olaf Scholz was about nuclear escalation. It was an excuse that he quite brazenly used as justification not to give more support to Ukraine on weapons in a somewhat notorious interview with Der Spiegel. In contrast, we've now got Mr. Merz, who is very keen on getting under that nuclear umbrella. And of course, what's motivating nearly all of Merz's defence reforms actually is this concern that Germany and Europe needs to be independent of the United States. There is this concern that the United States can't be relied on under the Trump administration, at least for security guarantees. And that's why Germany needs to spend more on defence. It needs to look after itself. It needs to look to the French for support in terms of nuclear escalation. It's all about making Germany and wider Europe less dependent on America.
Thanks, James. Great to have you in the studio for once. And now, to end the week with something a bit different. As long-standing listeners will know, our infinitely musical friend and creator of this podcast, David Knowles, found great solace in choral music and was himself an active member of University College Chapel Choir during his time at Durham University. Now, that choir has kindly sent us the following recording of Purcell's Hear My Prayer, O Lord, a piece of music that David loved and one that was performed at his funeral. It comes from a forthcoming album of music in David's memory, which also includes a new commission from one of his contemporaries. To learn more, and, if you wish, to support them as they raise money for the project, we have a link in the episode notes. For now, we wish you all the very best from London. Until next week, goodbye. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Durnley, Louisa Wells and David Knowles.